Our third speaker is Stacy Bullard, and the title of her project is... That's not the title. Can I holla at you for a second? Street harassment in the public performance of patriarchy in contemporary urban America. This project is a feminist intervention in and against the widely popular and accepted, yet generally under-researched practice of urban street harassment in contemporary American city spaces. Unlike conventional scholarship, which has generally tended to focus almost exclusively on the legal aspects and the psychological effects of this phenomenon, in this cultural study, Stacy Bullard seeks to rethink and expand the discourses and practices of street harassment to engage, among other things, the discourses and the contemporary scholarship on gender hierarchy, sexuality and subjectivity, critical studies of space and place, and queer theory in an attempt to highlight the larger and deeper structures and social forces animating this phenomenon. Utilizing critical textual analysis combined with the deconstruction of the patriarchal and capitalist ideologies expressed through street harassment, Bullard considers how the interaction of street harassment both informs and constitutes the parameters of gender-based inaccessibility in the American urban space through, among other things, disciplinary modes of gender constraints and policing. The project argues that due to its public performance, street harassment reconstitutes gender subjectivities in ways that serve to maintain and reproduce dominant, naturalized, heteronormative-patriarchal structures, practices, and subjectivities. According to Bullard, any political project, intellectual or otherwise, against street harassment should therefore first start by interrogating these larger social structures and forces. Our third presenter, Stacy Bullard.
Thank you, Jafar, and thank you all for coming. Holla and Stop Street Harassment are the two most recognized organizations to end street harassment in America. It was from these organizations and the work they produced that I began to form a complex understanding of street harassment, not only of its occurrence in my own life, but also of the multiple approaches to it in the context of a larger movement to end public sexual harassment. Both organizations have largely contributed to a revitalization of the anti-street harassment movement, and though I find distinct positive qualities of their efforts, I suggest that this movement depart from relying on analyses that argue for punitive legal policies and measures, and rather look at the larger structures that reinforce the normalization of public sexual harassment, the structures that enable it to be such a prevalent part of our contemporary urban life. Street harassment is symptomatic of and can only occur within larger social formations that allow and enable its normalization as a practice. Street harassment is a product of the patriarchal and capitalistic ideologies, discourses, and practices of our contemporary society. Viewing street harassment as a social, cultural phenomenon, rather than an act of individualistic deviancy, allows us to unpack the multiple determinations that constitute this social practice. This research is an attempt to identify and examine problematic elements of our urban American society, so that we may further understand sexual harassment as a pattern of behavior that may not be resolved within the limited and limiting discourse of issue-based politics found in the mission statements and research objectives of various popular political and activist projects. Rather than framing the relationship of street harassment through villain versus victim polarization, I hope to highlight that this behavior has, to deploy a phrase from Foucault, very specific historical and social, quote, conditions of possibility that both produce and facilitate street harassment. Deconstructing the patriarchal and capitalistic ideologies within a feminist and political economic framework, this thesis delegitimizes the normalization of the practice, as well as the social formations that will continue to produce and reproduce modes of domination and structures of oppression. Throughout my project, I discuss four major elements overlooked or misappropriated within anti-street harassment efforts: the American feminist history and effective framing of sexual harassment as an issue of social economic disenfranchisement, as well as what this suggests about the concerns of our social organization; the loss of communal orientation of cities, a product of neoliberal shifts into the privatization of urban spaces; the call for legal policing within a biased and inept legal and judicial system; and what I will mainly be elaborating on further today, the problematic and reductive role dichotomized gender binaries play in contemporary conversations of street harassment, which frames the man as the villain and the woman as the victim. But before I begin my analysis, I would like to show a brief sequence from a popular television show, Girls, that portrays street harassment and reflects both its practice and common occurrence. The accepted normalization of all parties depicted, the female Hannah, the male street harasser, and the dozens of other busy passerby New Yorkers, is particularly interesting as it reflects the larger social acceptance of public sexual harassment. Despite Hannah, the female, lacking the accordance to the definitive on-screen female constitution of what film theorists refer to as, quote, to be looked at in this, having just woken up in a disheveled and drug-induced slumber in the previous scene, we see Hannah physically and verbally sexually objectified by a man on the street. We see her reaction, and we see the reaction or lack thereof of the dozens of city dwellers passing by. A not surprising reality, as a setting of busy midtown Manhattan is understood as a hyper-capitalistic center, a place where spaces are designated for consumption and individualistic usage. By incorporating a few notions found within, but also departing from the psychoanalytic framework, a theoretical move in order to dissect and analyze this problematic relationship occurs. In her works, Laura Mulvey addresses concerns of the, quote, sexual instincts and identification processes that have meaning within the symbolic order which articulates desire, end quote. For Mulvey, as well as other psychoanalytic theorists, these instincts consist of voyeurism, scopophilia, and recognition identification, where the symbolic order is that of dominant patriarchal structures and the articulation of desire, the viewing of cinema, or more generally, the act of the, quote, controlling male gaze. Removing from Mulvey's theory the interaction with the cinema screen and instead replacing it with the environment of the urban public space creates a reappropriation of this theory that can be applied to the context of street harassment. Street harassment taken as the vocalization of this controlling male gaze is not done without problematic complications. However, the practice of the interaction and the power relations presented that are in service of the larger ideological structures and forces, namely that of patriarchy, reflect the similar experience of the gaze occurring in urban contemporary spaces. If it is most effective to address concerns of third-rate feminism with a post-structuralist application, then it is necessary to attempt to remove terms that produce binary polarizations of identity. Rather than asserting that it is the male gaze that controls the screen of public space, I argue that it is the patriarchal gaze that controls the screen of public space. And each of the players of street harassment and produces identities or subjectivities constituted through a stylized repetition of acts. By removing this demonizing characteristic that suggests there is a naturally occurring deviancy within the male that street harasses, we are enabled to further interrogate how the villain male is constructed as a subject of the same ideological assumptions that produce the victim female. The repetitive acts that Judith Butler claims constitutes the performance of gender can be located as the agents of identity within street harassment that are most commonly experienced, as what was depicted for us in this clip from the Girls. There are acts that are stylized through patriarchal roles, the objectified female as submissive, the male harasser as aggressive, and the remaining public as passive. Without acknowledging the ideology that produces and maintains these acts, therefore acknowledging the issue of street harassment as a result of pre-existing social formations, I argue that patriarchy will continue to be expressed through hierarchies of sexual and gender identity. Previous work on street harassment has relied on this binary polarization of gender, and therefore, the binaries of sexual desire and identity that too neatly produce a relationship of the aggressor-victim, male-female dichotomy. This is often done without unpacking the hierarchical structures that confine, limit, and produce the players who are performing such roles. If we are to function with a limited, polarized understanding of the relationship active within the interaction of street harassment, the identities of these players comes into being, a concept Judith Butler discusses, through the marks of the feminine gender as subordination. The female identity thus comes into being as a locale for masculine gaze, rendering the feminine gender as objects of sexual appeasement to the masculine. Yet this is an entirely incomplete relationship. It accounts for the distinction between sex and gender, but if we are to look at the experience of transgender women, further analysis becomes possible to view street harassment as a patriarchal tool of power that is, quote, necessarily external to the body itself. After a recent film screening of Noela Cabral's Walking Home, an experimental anti-street harassment film, a discussion was held on the experience of street harassment in the daily lives of the approximately 30 men and women present. This event was organized in collaboration with Holla Philly and took place in the downtown neighborhood of the city. Though not extensively written on, the experience of non-cis women, cis, a Latin prefix to denote sameness in one's biological sex and the expected heteronormative presentation of gender, particularly during stages of transition, and their experience with street harassment became the subject of this 2-hour-long discussion. The general consensus of the 10 to 20 transgender men present at this event was that their experience of street harassment as cis women were similar to what would be expected. Street harassment was a common occurrence. However, beginning at the early stages of transitioning onward, that experience of the normalized street harassment began to shift into a heightened form of both sexual and general threats and violence. Their appropriation and performance of masculinity threatened the power cis men believed solely belonged to cis men, where comments such as, quote, if you want to be a man, you got to fight like a man, end quote, and, quote, you just need a good fucking to get that out of you, end quote, were agreed by most to be similar to remarks heard throughout the transition and post-transition process. Judith Butler examines drag as a gender performance disruptive of the heteronormative naturalization of heterosexual identities, allowing an integration of queer theory to the conversation of ideologically deconstructing binary approaches to street harassment. She writes, quote, drag constitutes the mundane way in which genders are appropriated, theatricalized, worn, and done. It implies all gendering is a kind of impersonation and approximation. If this is true, it seems there is no original or primary gender that drag imitates, but gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original, end quote. The transgender, a gender identity that incorporates drag, performance of once cis women, incited eagerness for cis men to reassert their power and belief in the notion that their position was one of the original and therefore correct behavior. If street harassment is the expression of patriarchal ideology and is expressed as a reassertion of domination manifested through gender dichotomy, the further harassment experienced by the trans performance that inherently calls into question the natural privilege this dichotomy produces is understandably further aggressive by the actors attempting to maintain patriarchy's position. Sometime after this post-screening discussion began of the experience of trans men, the conversation took a turn to address how exactly these men often perform their masculinity. This was often done through the performance of street harassment. This denaturalization of gender construction, yet affirmation of the ideological assumptions that are carried within the performance of genders, points again to the larger ideological structures that lie outside of any individual subject it contains, despite the attempt to free oneself from the cis expectations of bodily heteronormative culture. Trans performance is left without the agency to act or escape from the relations of power, the relations of heteropatriarchal society. The patriarchal nature of urban public spaces, where perceptions of hierarchical gender constructions are heightened, yet where individual agency to act against those structures is limited, is anchored through capitalistic ideals of the neoliberal privatization of public spaces. Without the anchor of the public space as a place embedded in and produced through ideological structures, street harassment would not be further enabled to occur. The repetitive acts of street harassment that become routine experiences and produce distinct identities of harassers, harassees, and bystanders have become the spatial practices of contemporary urban public that implicates gender and sexual difference and underscore the contested status of the urban's multiple attachments to the larger hierarchical order of social organization. Various researchers and organizations in pursuit of the eradication. However, it is to my belief that although the strong urge of these organizations place on pursuing punitive legal policy against aggressors would result in diminished occurrences of street harassment, it will not result in a society that no longer functions under structures that will continue to produce new forms of sexism, oppression, and identity hierarchies. As street harassment shifts back into the public sphere of mainstream attention, perhaps now more than ever seen before, the leading organizations campaigning around policy reform for an end to public sexual harassment must be carefully considered and pursue actions logically implemented and with reference to the cultural and political context to which they are placed. Both the Stop Street Harassment and Holla organizations have undeniably provided useful assets in progressing the anti-street harassment movement by acting as a resource to input multiple reconsiderations of the cultural understandings of female bodies in public space. However, I suggest that further research be executed on the realistic outcomes of policy change in a society represented by an overwhelmingly privileged majority as the governing state. I suggest that future research on street harassment and within larger interventions of gender-based inequalities should be executed with a critical eye to further realize the implications that parties demographically targeted by punitive legal policy as the subjects that will inevitably be targeted by street harassment reform, those marginalized by their racial, ethnic, and economic identity. Despite some specific and radical breaks in conventional approaches, I argue that the majority of contemporary conversations on street harassment are caught in approaches that rely on reductive essentialisms of gender and need to be rethought in order to depart from the limiting perspective of street harassment as a case of individual issue politics. The social phenomenon of street harassment is an expression of capitalistic and patriarchal ideologies that assume very specific forms that should continually be analyzed as a symptom of a larger social formation and conjunction.